Professor. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome to the ITS seminar. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Thomas Sanchez from Virginia Tech to speak with us. Professor Thomas Sanchez earned his PhD in city planning from Georgia Tech and is currently a professor of urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech in the National Capital Region. He conducts research in the areas of transportation, social justice, technology, and scholarly impact. His most recent books, Networks and in the Knowledge Economy, with Dennis Bedford, was published in 2021, and Planning Knowledge and Research was published by Routledge in 2018. He has co-authored 3 other books, including Planning as if People Matter, Governing for Social Equity, The Right to Transportation, Moving to Equity, and the Social Impacts of Urban Containment. So let's welcome Professor Thomas Sanchez and give it to him for the presentation. Thank you, Professor Sanchez.
Well, thank you. And if you don't mind, can we quickly go around and have everybody introduce themselves and just let me know kind of what program they're in and kind of where they're at in their program? Would that be okay?
Sure. We would love to. Hi, guys. Would you mind to unmute yourself and introduce yourself? Can we start with Caesar?
All right, yeah. Hey, I'm Caesar, or Julius Caesar Agoma, a PhD student in the Computer Science Department and ITS. My research is mainly in algorithmic game theory towards social problems like transportation, or housing, or waste reduction, but mainly transportation. Right.
Awesome. Can we follow with Lou? Lou, are you here?
Oh, yes, I'm here. Hello, Professor Sanchez. My name is Lu. My research focuses on the impact of online shopping and self-driving on household travel and logistics. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you for coming today.
Great. Thank you. Can we follow with Elaine?
Good morning, my name is Elaine. I am a first-year PhD student, and I'm currently working on a project with Seaway on it does have to do with transportation and land use and also equity. So I think this is going to be really helpful and really interesting. So thank you for being here for us.
Can we follow with Humba? Or can we follow with Monica if Humba is currently busy?
Sure. I'm Monica, as a PhD student in the Transportation System Engineering program. I'm currently working on the impact of autonomous and connected vehicles on environmental justice initiatives.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Can we start with Maxwell? Hi, Maxwell.
Yeah, hey, everybody. My name is Maxwell Cabello. I'm a first-year doctoral student in urban planning and public policy. And my interest is mostly around equity and like the housing policy sphere, but I'm also on the same project with Seaway and Elaine. So it's really relevant to that conversation and my work in general.
Thank you, Maxwell. Can we follow with Nagin?
Hello, everyone. I'm Nagin. I'm a PhD student in transportation system engineering. I worked on network generation for purposes of like studying other algorithms, but I'm currently working on improving transit system by using TNC replacement and those things. Thank you.
Yeah, can I follow with Ronnie? Hi, Ronnie.
Hi, I'm Ronnie, first year PhD student. I haven't started really on any research project yet, but like my interest is mostly in networks, specifically Bayesian methods used on networks. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Ronnie. We have 2 more students, Humba and Yin. Can you unmute yourself and have a brief introduction?
Hi, I'm Yen Shim, and I'm visiting student from Inha University in South Korea. And I majored in logistics. Nice to see you guys. Hi.
Yeah, thank you. What about Hembla? Oh, Hembla says my mic doesn't work. Okay. And Hembla is also a visiting scholar at ITS. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for the introduction part. Let's give back to Professor Sanchez. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That always helps. That always helps me kind of knowing who I'm talking with and what your background and interests are. I grew up in Southern California, and when I left there, I was living in Laguna Beach. My last job was in Tustin, actually.
Whoa, so, please, pretty much the Irvine area, this Orange County.
I'm very, and I was working with a private developer that was building in Newport Beach and those areas, Mission Viejo. So I'm very familiar with the area that you all are in. You're very, very, very lucky to be in that in that location and at that great school.
Welcome, welcome. So glad to have you. Maybe next time we could invite you in person. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So when I was doing my my doctoral studies, well, actually, let me go back even further than that. During the when would that have been? During the late 1980s, there was a housing crash, and I was working for a private developer, and the sales and all of the activity slowed down so much that we all got laid off. And I had been thinking about wanting to go back to school at some point to get my PhD. And so I took that as a sign that this must be the time. And what had happened at that point is I had a master's degree in urban planning, but I was working for a for-profit developer, and all that time, as I was working with planners, kind of in a different capacity, more and more questions came to mind about how we do planning review, how different sorts of exactions and developer fees and other requirements for road building, and how all of this, how the developer thought about the planning process and how the two work together. So it was actually great preparation for me to go back to school to ask these questions. And one of the questions that I particularly had in mind was about fairness, and whether that was things that were fair or unfair to the public, things that I saw as being fair or unfair to private companies that were trying to build housing, that were trying to provide employment opportunities, that were helping to build infrastructure. I had lots of questions, and a lot of that came out of my planning education. I was told one thing, but then once I got into, the reality of it on the ground, it was like some things don't really kind of match up here. And again, with that focus on what's fair. We weren't really calling it equity, wasn't really kind of part of the vocabulary at that time. So I was going back to school like in 1990, and so I started to focus. I had a particular interest on transportation networks, and so how transportation systems serve the city, how they provided for mobility and accessibility to places, so how they tied the city and the region together. obviously, obviously transportation is vital to all of us, to our daily lives. And what I've when I got into it a little bit further, asking questions that I'll be bringing up in this presentation, I started to ask I started to wonder, well, what is fairness, and how do we measure it? And legally, what does that mean? How do we enforce things like that? How do we know whether the level of unfairness or inequity has risen to the level of being challenged in court, or being illegal, or to that point where there is some kind of penalties involved, however you want to look at that. And so my dissertation was on, I was in Atlanta at the time at Georgia Tech. And so the question that I had was, is the transportation network in the Atlanta region, I was focusing mainly on Atlanta proper, is that system designed in such a way that it gives advantages to certain populations compared to others, and particularly by race and also by income level? And there are, if you go back into the history of Atlanta and the MARTA system there, the rail system, there was a particular county to the north, Cobb County, that opted out of being part of that because of, because of who rides transit and what that might mean for the county. So basically, they wanted to exclude certain parts of segments of the population from accessing or going to their county, and in their words and view, bring crime and other kind of negative effects to the county, which is obviously ridiculous. But this was the similar thinking that happened in Washington, D.C. with the metro system in Washington, D.C. in Georgetown. Georgetown opted out of having a metro line for the same exact reason, because the lower income people, the non-whites, were the ones that use transit, and we don't want them in our community. Obvious discrimination, obvious racism on that level. But the interesting thing in both of those cases is, they're not gonna say those things as overtly, but they're going to use other kinds of language and other tactics to try to get around these things. So the whole kind of infractions around discrimination aren't quite that obvious. And these people, people that are in control of these systems are they're aware of that. So it takes it's a little bit challenging to get at this question of equity or discrimination, particularly around around transportation, around a lot of things: housing, environmental effects, other public services. But what we tend to find is that our policymakers, particularly, at the federal and state, all levels for that matter, really what they're fighting over is the placement of these projects. These projects are money. These projects are investment. And so much of the focus goes on who's going to get what, where's the money gonna flow to, rather than paying close attention to what are the social and economic benefits of these investments, and how can we use these investments to help correct past injustices or current imbalances and inequities. We hear this a little bit when we hear about how many jobs, like with the transportation bill, that's huge, and there's always discussion about how many jobs it's going to bring. That tends to be pretty loose language, but again, it's really about the dollars that can be brought back to certain states, which then go back to voting districts and in other jurisdictions, and the politicians can take credit for what they've brought home. But my interest was around kind of in this decision making. What were the social and economic impacts involved? How are they distributed? How can we measure that? And then how is that related to some level of oversight and some level of where people are or groups of people or communities can challenge that decision making when they haven't received their fair share. And so this actually, when I was doing my dissertation work around this area, there was really just mainly just the work of Robert Bullard and his environmental justice work down in the South about industrial plant placements and how those were more likely to occur in non-white regions of areas, and kind of the whole environmental justice issue. And while I was doing my research without the internet, mind you, I was trying to find out whether certain communities, states, MPOs at the time, if anybody had an equity plan. Because I was curious to look at how is this being planned for? How is this being thought of? And, the best I could do was somebody told me, well, I heard Chicago has put a plan like that together. Well, at that time, all I could really do was, I'm not sure if I was emailing at the time, if I was able to contact people that way, or actually writing letters, if you can imagine that. Writing letters to these organizations saying, I heard you might have an equity plan in place. I'd love to get a copy of it. I never came across a plan. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, historically, going back to the early 90s, there were no equity plans. There was no transportation equity. There was nothing in this realm that was helping inform policymakers around, let's evaluate our transportation systems. Let's make investments that take equity and fairness into account. And so, despite, in my opinion, despite the lack of improvements or that we've made in the area of social equity related to cities, the conversation is so much bigger now than it used to be. So if you want to look at that as progress, I agree with that, but it has to move beyond the conversation and the discussion to the actual decisions we're making and the investments that we're making in cities and in regions. So a lot has happened. A lot has changed, in that 30-year period, but we've still got a lot more to do. I think related to transportation equity, one of the challenges that we have is, when we look at, or when we use that term, when we say equity, well, what are we talking about with equity? And even if we say fairness, what is fair? And is equity mean equality? Does that mean everybody gets the same thing? Everybody gets the same amount of transportation access. Everybody gets the same level of, bus service frequency. Everybody can reach all of the jobs in the same amount of time. That's not realistic. That's not possible. Just because of the way that we've developed cities and just the way that cities arrange themselves spatially, as well as geographically. This idea of it being equal, especially with different income levels, different abilities to pay, different households types, different needs, different preferences. It's not about being equal. I think it's about being unfair or an undue burden on certain groups, certain households compared to others. And when we're talking about on the transportation side, are we talking about fair levels of mobility? Is it about accessibility? Is it about opportunities that are available, or are we looking at outcomes? So are we, since we always hear that transportation is a derived demand, that we don't do transportation just for transportation's sake. We do transportation to accomplish other things. So we use transportation to get to a job so we can earn money, or we use transportation to buy food for our family, or we use transportation to visit family and friends or make it to the doctor. We have these other things we do, and transportation just facilitates that. And so when the focus on transportation equity is purely on access or mobility, I think one of the questions that comes to mind is, well, is that what we're really trying to optimize? Is that what we're trying to maximize, is just that ability to move around? Or are we looking at those outcomes? So things like employment levels or educational attainment. Everybody can make it to school. Everybody has access to good health care. Everybody has access to food. And all of these other different needs. So this is, for me, this is one of the challenging parts of the concept of transportation equity is, well, what are we, what are we trying to accomplish? Because we've got this term that's very broad, transport, and whether that's movement or access or whatever it might be, and equity. So is that fairness? Is that discrimination? Is that, how are we measuring that? And does it mean the same thing to all people? And I would say, no, it doesn't. And particularly when we are considering this relative to outcomes, which again is another question on whether we should, or not. And I think in the literature, what you'll see is measures of, levels of access to employment centers, levels of, access by, public transportation. So there'll be comparisons based on mode. If you look at it, probably cars provide the most equitable, is the most equitable transportation mode, other than the cost of ownership, for different level income levels. But a car will take you anywhere you want, whenever you want, and you can get and everybody pretty much, can move around as they need at the same level. Except in some cases where we get into tolling and other kind of pricing for that service. So the point here being, transportation equity itself as a question is very challenging when you start to break it down, and particularly from a research perspective, when you want to try to measure these things, and when you want to analyze, where is equity occurring, where is it not occurring related to transportation services. And I think about this equity question recently, reading, Plato's Republic for the first time recently. And in the first part of the book, there's a discussion about justice. And the question comes up the quote is, and what is that which justice gives, and to whom? And so I think it's an interesting question, for us on the side of creating policies, and for those that are kind of taking the larger view of what justice and equity are, is who is it for? Who are we really creating this justice and this equity for? What are the interests involved? And so if we make a statement like, well, it's good for society. Well, how is that true? And how do we know that? And in other cases, what a situation that's inequitable is, we might be talking about a redistribution of resources or wealth. And who's not going to be happy about that? The people who are being taken from to be given, to somebody else who doesn't have. Okay, well, that's creating equity, but it's not going to be happy times for everybody. So, when we think about this redistribution, and ultimately that's what we're talking about when we're creating transportation equity or any kind of equity. We've got an imbalance in our distribution of goods and services. So we need to fix that. We need to change that system of distribution, which means I might get less so that somebody else can get a fair share. Well, in reality, that's not going to feel good. And usually in that case, the people that have more, the groups that have more, have the power to hang on to it and aren't going to be willing to let go of it. So, I think that brings up a couple of questions as far as who are we thinking about in terms of justice, in terms of creating a balanced and fair system, and how do we make that work? Because as we know, not everybody abides by the social contract of working towards the public, towards a public good, whatever that is, however that is defined, which certainly there is no agreement about that, what is good for, or when we're talking about the common good. So again, transportation equity is a challenge, it's a challenging concept as we dig into it more deeply. And it's not just simply from an analytical perspective, just a kind of a spatial analysis or equity analysis that we see in comparisons of different levels of service levels by demographic groups and so forth. We've got lots of other considerations, which I'll mention just a few of them in the time that we have. Let's see. We have a variety. So backing up a little bit. So my interest became, partly, how do we measure equity? How do we use that in policy making? How do we use that in planning? But also the other part of it was, once we recognize that we have an inequity, what do we do about it? So legally, what avenues are there to use? What level, what kind of recourse do we have when we see it? And then also from a governance perspective, what kind of guidance, what kind of laws can we put in place to at least encourage, as well as provide oversight on equitable policy making and activities as they affect different communities. So the first, which I'll spend most of my time on, is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and I'll talk about that why. But we've got a whole handful. We have a variety of guidance related to social equity matters. So we've got Executive Order 12898, which is about environmental justice, which is just strongly suggesting that we think about it. As we make plans, as we make policies, when we're looking at investments, we need to consider the impacts on different groups, based on costs and benefits or questions of fairness. NEPA also looks at these impacts, although doesn't explicitly look at questions of fairness. It looks at environmental impacts, but it really needs to be within the scoping process of, say, environmental impact report or environmental impact statement, that there are potential equity issues or negative impacts as part of a project that's being analyzed. And so it usually isn't relied upon certainly for transport equity or social justice purposes. A couple of the big transportation funding bills, ICE-T and T21, tried to include language in them that said basically for jurisdictions like states and MPOs, you're not going to get your money if we find that you're engaged in discriminatory practices. And so, but there again, the language is pretty loose, and how they actually, made any kind of determination that these kinds of activities were occurring at the state or metropolitan level, was very hard to do. But I guess you could say it was a positive thing that at least it made it into, a bill as important as those, which really end up being directly and indirectly trillions of dollars, across the nation. Also, different agencies of the federal government had their own environmental justice language that they used, and we see kind of at the lower level metropolitan planning organizations, which I think have really, and some of this coming out of the influence and encouragement from the federal government, are in a sense at the forefront of regional transportation planning with with particular respect to transportation, since that's most of what they do. That's most of what they handle, is looking at transportation services on a regional scale, working with member jurisdictions to look across a variety of transportation issues, whether it's by mode or if it's about safety. Many MPOs also have citizen advisory committees, which deal with, and some have some separate environmental justice committees to inform their MPO boards. So yeah, I think we've seen a lot of advances in that case, just in terms of the community involvement part. We can argue about whether that's effective or not. And some of the other research that I've done has looked at MPO board membership and how they represent different how those board members represent different parts of a metropolitan area. And so if you think about it on a per jurisdiction basis, the urban area gets less voting power. If the city, at the core gets one vote and has a very dense population, large population, and the city out in the suburbs gets one vote, where we don't see any weighting in terms of population being represented, inequities can be created. So if we put all of those suburban votes together compared to, say the one or two urban votes, well, then, just a simple scenario would be the investments that are made, the voting that will happen will favor the suburbs. Some of in addition, on board membership, I've looked at racial, ethnic, and gender representation across these boards and whether that reflects the communities that they're supposed to be representing. The interesting thing about that, though, is just like with any other policy board or political appointee, or even elected in the case of Portland, Oregon, a lot of those conversations and negotiations take place before and after the board meeting, and so it's actually pretty rare to see a contentious vote make it all the way to like an MPO board meeting, because all the politicking has already happened. So we don't really see what kinds of deals have been made, what kind of trade-offs have been occurred, particularly in relative to what's going to happen in the city and what's going to happen outside of the city, and what the overall kind of regional effects are going to be. But I would say the hope is always that the community involvement element of this, either at an advisory committee level, advising the board, or more generally, the public that attends these meetings and voices their opinion will help. But one of the realities here is, and for those of you in planning, you're well aware of this, most people don't know planning exists. Most people don't realize that there are planning organizations that are making plans for all of the roads being built, for where all the houses are going, where all the jobs are going to be located, where all the utilities are being run, all the other services. They don't realize there are people thinking about these things on a daily basis, and this is including and as part of that, what the planners are doing, what the engineers are doing, what the designers are doing, what the public administrators are doing. There's so much happening behind the scenes, and I'm willing to bet that maybe 1 out of 100 people that you talk to know that there are metropolitan planning organizations, and maybe half of those one person knows what the charge of MPOs are. So I mentioned this, there's not likely going to be a high level of community involvement at that level if nobody knows it even exists, if nobody even knows that there's that opportunity to participate. So we like to say within planning, you know, it's a democratic process. We're involving the constituents in all of the plan making, but if the constituents aren't aware of where or how or when that they can participate, their voices aren't going to be heard. And that is actually one area of transportation equity that or any type of equity within governance that's very important, is that community involvement piece. How, you know, have we taken the public's preferences and needs into account in their criticisms and their comments and suggestions? Has that been part of the plan making? And I would say, unfortunately, more times it has not, at least on a broad basis. That participation tends to happen by those with resources and those with assets to protect, and basically property owners and business owners that already have a level of power that they want to be able to maintain. And so they're more likely to know, they're more likely to be involved. I think one hope out of, and I'm sure there will be some studies coming out on this, but one hope is out of the disaster that COVID has been, but one hope is that with a lot of these public meetings going online, hopefully that's increasing the visibility to a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't have participated. And I don't know yet. I'm unaware of any studies that have been done. If that has indeed been the case, if we've actually had people, be able to attend some of these meetings remotely, or at least been able to watch them, because they've been more available than, actually having to go down to the town hall, in the middle of the day, no less, to be involved with one of these meetings. So maybe there will be some electronic, some kind of digital, advantage coming out of it. I don't know yet, but we'll hopefully we'll see. Okay, lots of background there. What I wanted to run through, since the key law, the key guidance in all of this is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And among all of these, they're more encouraging language. They're more of suggestions. I would say very little legal sort of teeth or backing to them, but it's Title VI that is key. And so, and that is the anti-discrimination element of Title VI and Section 601, where basically no person in the country can be discriminated against for anything that's provided from a federal perspective. So even though this says federal financial assistance, it's kind of any kind of federal assistance. You can't favor some groups versus others. You can't exclude some groups or others on the grounds of race, color, national origin, as you are providing federal goods or services. So this is the main law that is used in order to challenge cases of discrimination, particularly in kind of the area that I'm aware of is related to transportation investment and services. And so you'll notice in the language, it refers to persons, not citizens. So that's anybody. So that's anybody in the U.S. I think that's important to note. And the other thing about as a difference between a beneficiary and a participant. And so, as you know, lots of organizations do the work of the federal government. So just because somebody isn't receiving those services directly from the federal government, if there's some intermediary organization or program that's providing it, they are liable. They are liable as part of this act. And so one example would be a subcontractor. So that means if a transit agency is building a new rail line, well, it's not just the liability doesn't stop just at the transit agency. It also applies to those contractors in terms of their practices, who they employ, their different, their different practices in their operations, where non-discrimination effects apply to them as well. So anybody or any race can file a complaint. I'll get back to that. There's some caveats there. And we've got some categories and classifications that we have to use related to protected classes and all that on whether the discrimination is happening based on race or ethnicity, country of origin sorts of things. So there are some definitions that are being used there. And I mentioned this before, the financial assistance, it's not just direct like grants or loans or some kind of transfer financially. It could also be some services that are supposed to be provided that aren't happening or that are happening disproportionately. And who are the recipients? I'm going to run through a bit of this. Gets into a little bit of detail, but again, we have recipients, we have subrecipients, and they all have to conform to the letter of the act. And a difference that the difference between who benefits and who the recipients are, and again along that, when we think about how these services are, the flow of those, and who is in the middle, who is the ultimate receiver or beneficiary of these services, and how those are weighed. Institution. And so in this case, if we've got an institution that handles transportation, well, they're going to be viewed from the standpoint of not just the transportation activities they're involved with, but they're also going to be viewed from, say, hiring practices, contracting, other kinds of agreements that they're in other kinds of arrangements that they have that may not be directly related to that. In this case, to that transportation service that's being provided, since they are an institution that's been being looked over. Okay, a little more detail just as far as what Title VI is. I think you got kind of what the non-discrimination perspective is on this. Here's two very important distinctions as far as any kind of violation of equity or in terms of discrimination. So we see disparate treatment and disparate impact. So a disparate treatment, which is really the important criteria, and that's where the violation or the discrimination is happening intentionally. And disparate impact is where, you know, an agency is providing their services and just not, you know, not everybody in the community or in the region receives the same amount of service. A transit agency builds a light rail system. Not everybody's going to benefit from it the same. Not everybody's going to have the same level of access. Not everybody's going to be able to use it the same way. You know, costs may be different. There's no way, or it's going to be extremely difficult for that to be kind of equal service, you know, to everybody. And that's just the nature of the way that business activity is being conducted. It's not intentionally disfavoring some communities compared to others. That's a very important point here related to the to Title VI, because when these cases go to court, which is ultimately how these inequities or discrimination is challenged, it has to go to court. That's the final word. That's where the determinations are made and any remedies are handed out. Ultimately, that's where it all goes. It goes to the court to figure all of this out. Okay. And well, running through this, we'll get back to those 2 points. So we can see where we can, you know, we've got disparate impacts that can occur. You know, we're putting in, you know, different sorts of investments around our communities, and, you know, it just can't be provided evenly throughout the community. There are going to be different levels of benefit, and that's going to be very hard. You know, we can try to minimize those differences, but it's, you know, it's going to be extremely difficult no matter how hard we try. Okay. And the way the court looks at this is they're saying from a business perspective, from the interest of the business. So let's say a fare increase. Okay, and if that just happened to affect low-income communities or racial or ethnic communities more than others, they'll say the business would, or the agency would argue the structure of this fare increases is helping us stay in business. It's not done to overtax or overcharge any particular group. It's just the way that we have to recoup these costs based on the design of the system. So for instance, it might be a case where communities that are further out along lines, okay, are going to pay higher fares because of the distances and the operational costs involved. Well, that transit agency is trying to connect that whole region, so lines have to be run out there. They're charging more for those more distant or remote locations, but it's not based on because of who lives there. It's because of the costs of doing business to get the lines to run out there. So that would be a case where a group of citizens would come together that are in some suburban location. They'll say, we are being discriminated against because we are paying higher fares compared to somebody in the central city, And for the same level, for the same type of service, to be able to use this rail system to get around. Well, that would be viewed from the perspective, or the case that would be made is, it costs us more to provide you service. We want to provide you service. We want you to be on the network, but there's no, you know, from a business perspective, we can't charge you less. We can't charge you the same amount as everyone else. So something like that, you know, a lawsuit or a challenge like that would likely be dismissed because the business is just trying to function in an efficient financial way. And if there was no proven intent to discriminate or charge that particular community, you know, because of who they are, then there would be no case. Okay. Well, one thing that happened, a case that came up that's important for Title VI challenges is an individual cannot bring a lawsuit challenging, say, a federal agency for discrimination. So what has to happen is it has to be a group of people. It has to be a class of people, because they're saying if it's some kind of, the court is looking at it from the standpoint of, if this is systematic discrimination, it wouldn't be happening to just one person. You would need to have more proof. It would need to have more impact than on just one person. So there needs to be a class of people, so that a class of people might be by race or by income level or by their community or their location. It's got to be happening to a group of people who are bringing this in, saying this discrimination is happening to us. And it was the Sandoval case that eliminated basically the ability of an individual, you know, or one person to come in and challenge the federal government on Title VI regulations. So that's
excuse me, Professor Sanchez. This is a 90-minute seminar, and we are already 60 minutes. So I think we want to leave 10 to 15 minutes for the audience for questions.
I'll wrap up in about 5-10 minutes just to get through because I think I've hit most of the main points.
Sure, appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Lots of regulations. I'm just going to skip over this for now. This is a lot of the detail. More of that. There is guidance that transit agencies receive. There's been some transportation research out of TCRP and NCHRP looking at how do we measure equity? How do we build standards for these things to use for our planning purposes? Get to a couple of a lot more detail in here than I remembered. Some important resources on either one of these, if you just look up, on the FTA site, if you're interested in Title VI or civil rights and transportation, some good resources there. This is kind of one of the things I wanted to get to. There have really been two main cases that have gone to court, and I just briefly wanted to explain each of these. One is the LA Bus Rider Union case, where the challenge there was that, again, LA Bus Riders Union, so a class of people, the challenge there was, hey, the transit system, the transit investment making is shifting resources to rail away from bus. And so we know that rail tends to have a different kind of ridership compared to bus riders. So they were saying that was discrimination. This was actually a successful challenge that ended in a consent decree, which basically said, changes and investments need to be made to right this imbalance. So that you can think of that as kind of a judgment, but it was directing the transit agency to fix their. So this was a major case. If you're interested, you could check into it. The other one was the Darensburg versus AC Transit case in the Bay Area. And Sylvia Darensburg, since she was an individual, could not challenge, in this case, a similar sort of funding, shift of funding from bus to rail, where she lost her job because she didn't have the bus service available to her again. They put a class of people together to challenge it. And what this case was not successful. The challenge was not successful because the court said that the change in service, the funding in service, the discrimination that ended up occurring was not intentional. There was no proof that AC Transit intended to harm, these particular groups. I don't actually think there was a finding of intent, which is very important in any of these cases, on the LA Bus Riders Union. But I think the evidence was so clear in that case that there was that separation of funding, that there was harm being done to a certain class. Two very important cases. Got some other things, kind of so many topics of interest related to this that I'm not going to talk about. And finally, so when we think about transportation equity, we've got the planning phase, which involves, the process of planning, the community involvement, the contracting. We've got the funding piece of it, which involves kind of how the investments are made, who's involved with that, who benefits. All of that can be challenged. Either of that part there can be challenged as being inequitable. Then we have the delivery of those services. So what's actually being delivered on the ground? Where are the routes going? Where level of service? What service frequency? What's the convenience of these places? What kind of condition are they in? That can be challenged as well. And then we see the impacts on the users, things like locations that aren't safe, somebody losing their job because of service inadequacy. So that can be an area of challenge. And then if we're considering the outcomes of all of this, being able to use transportation has community effects, individual effects on the neighborhood, whether I can get to school, childcare, jobs, and all of that. And that also becomes a question. So going back to my initial, or my opening on this is as far as, all of the nuance and complexity, if you will, about what transport equity is. This is my kind of summary about, it's a process, and it's not just about, the delivery of these services and where these services go and how they're built. It's about the whole planning process and then what comes out in the end and how our communities are affected. Okay, and I'll stop there. And happy to answer any questions or hear your comments.
Thank you, Professor Sanchez, for the very excellent talk. Are there any questions from the audience? Let me first give a pause for Professor Sanchez. Thank you so much. Thank you. I saw Caesar's unmute. Any questions from Caesar?
No, I was following the applause as well. I think it was a great talk, and I appreciate Professor Sanchez taking the time to come speak to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sanchez. I actually have a question. So I saw there's a slide in the presentation. It calls about the measurement of equity.
Right.
As an engineer, as a planner, we also want to plan the city to be more equitable, more sustainable. Right. I'm wondering what might be some possible metrics for measuring equity that we could apply into planning and engineering.
Right. Well, that's an excellent question and something that I'm particularly interested in because the way I approach these things is if you can't measure it, we can't evaluate it. We can't, we can't compare it. We can't say whether it meets a certain threshold or standard or not. So in my mind, there have to be ways to measure these things. And what we find is if you look across the country, particularly with MPOs, and this is something that I've done, is I've looked at equity plans with that question in mind of how are they measuring it. And you will find, everybody's kind of doing it differently. And so it ends up being kind of, location or context specific, because in some regions, say the Midwest or, or in the South or, the types of, and certainly by city size and scale, the types of issues that they're concerned about, like some of these cities don't have rail. So that as a mode can't be part of any kind of measures of accessibility or mobility. Some cities don't have, certain levels or tight interconnections with bus systems. Some don't have intercity rail. So it's that is kind of the main question in my mind is about how we measure these things, because when it comes down to testing it and evaluating it, we need something. And if it's going to be challenged in court, the court ends up hearing the methodology or how, and that's just for that specific case. They really don't have anything to compare it to. So they don't have like a ITE trip generation manual to say, okay, here's the level of equity you should have, and you don't have it. And so I think this is, there's been plenty of research done on it, but to this point, there haven't been any recognized standards. And I think that's a very, very, very important issue for this, and particularly for enforcement, or to challenge any of these cases, or for a neighborhood to say, hey, we're only getting, X level of transportation services, and, the community or a neighborhood on the other side of town is getting Y. There's nothing tangible to use. I will mention another interest in this current project I have, funded by the National Science Foundation, is using artificial intelligence for planning. And this is one area, where we've got issues around bias that are built into plan making. This is exactly your question is exactly what I would like to see built in to some of our, for instance, our machine learning models as we look at plans, as we assess plans, what is that equity measure that, that we're looking at? What are the outcomes? What are the inputs involved with that? And how can we do that on a, how can we operationalize that with all the different data sets that we've got out there? So great question. And still we're lots of people are, well, not a lot, some people are still working on that.
Yeah, and there's a Maxwell, raise hand. Yeah, Maxwell. I know Maxwell is also working on the equity metrics in the project that we're working on. Yeah, Maxwell,
yeah,
please go ahead.
Exactly. I've actually been doing a lot of research on that project of current metrics that MPOs are using. One interesting thing I came across was, like I saw a lot of similar ones being used, I think, to kind of meet some of these legal requirements. But I'll give an example of one I thought was like kind of weird. I was looking at a couple of Texas MPOs, the Dallas and Houston ones in particular, and they were using metrics of around job accessibility by different modes. But obviously spatially, like those cities have a long history of, lower income minorities being concentrated in the city centers and the suburbs being primarily affluent and white. So the numbers flesh out to look like, oh, these marginalized communities have more access to jobs, hospitals, resources. So obviously it seems like maybe those metrics aren't the best to use. I just didn't know if you had any thoughts about how to approach scenarios like that, and like what kind of thinking needs to go to kind of properly apply metrics in cities where this, like the spatial makeup and history doesn't adhere easily to like some of the current metrics being used.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that's kind of exactly what I've run across myself. Entering this with the hypothesis of, well, it's the low income people that have the poor level of access. Well, when you look at it spatially, it's not. And particularly if they're at the urban core, they've got those locations have the best access to services. And so if anything, people living out in the suburbs are the losers. So it's like, well, that's where I started to broaden my view on when we're talking about equity, the transportation piece probably shouldn't be separated from the particular service that we're linking it to. So something like access to affordable housing. Okay, well, in that case, if you've got low income people living at the urban core, they're paying higher rents in the urban core despite having lower transport costs, or in general, or their accessibility to healthcare that might be more expensive to them, or their access to educational services which are poorer quality. So this is where, when we're talking about equity and access in these cases, it's access to what, and what is the quality that they're receiving from whatever they're connected to, because the transport piece of that alone doesn't explain really the disadvantage that they're put in.
Thank you.
Are you working on is this your dissertation topic?
No, with me, Siwei and Elaine are all on this funded project, working with the community partner that's looking at metrics and how to maybe incorporate them into modeling. And so I've been doing that the last quarter, looking into it.
Is there anything online about that project? I'd be interested in seeing what you guys are doing, or is it kind of at the early stages?
They're still in early stages. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, but I could obviously share some links on our ITS website. There's news of, oh, we get this project, so there's some description on that.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, the project is basically revamping the planning for the MPOs. We adding equity metrics that obviously Maxwell is currently developing, and then we basically propose a prescriptive model for the planning agency to give them an optimal combination of the policies. Mm-hmm. Usually the equity and sustainability and the mobility usually as constraints in the optimization problems.
Right.
But we move all of them to the objective of the optimization problems, and maybe use Bayesian optimization or simulation-based optimization to suggest, to prescribe a bunch of quote-unquote optimal policies.
Right.
Yeah, but we're still working on that. It's a 4-year project from
Yeah.
National Science Foundation.
Yeah, great project.
Yeah.
Who's the faculty lead on that? Or is there a faculty lead?
It's basically led by Professor Mike Hyland. And there's other co-PIs, including Maxwell's advisor, Professor Nicholas Moranz from planning department. And there are also a bunch of other faculties like the director of ITS, Steve Ritchie, and other faculties like Professor J.J. Krishnan and Professor Renong Jin.
You know, a quick comment I want to make about that too is some of the criticism that I've heard about trying to use, say, you know, some kind of AI models or some kind of other analytical techniques to, you know, identify or remedy, you know, bias, you know, or to make recommendations in the plan making, I actually kind of totally disagree with, because as you guys know, in working on this project, it makes you better try to understand, you know, the decision-making process, all the variables involved with, you know, with different types of services, different communities that are being served, and all you know, kind of all the different pieces that need to be arranged, you know, in an optimal way to do, you know, to do the planning. So it's not, you know, it's not black box. It's not like, you know, we're just going to toss this, you know, into a neural network and it's going to, you know, it's going to figure this out. All, you know, we're going to be able to explain kind of all the pieces, and it's got to fit, you know, it's so, yeah, I think that's really fascinating work.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sanchez. Yeah, as you say, it's not just math. You have to understand the people, understand the scenarios behind the planning.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments. Definitely speak to the professors about it.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Any other question from the audience?
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. Any of you that have kind of any interest in, I'll put my email in the chat, and any interest you have, you know, around any of these topics, if there's any way that that I can help out, I'd be more than happy to talk with you about that.
Thank you, Professor Sanchez. Appreciate that.
Okay. Well, have a very good weekend.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
And thank you again. Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye. Nice having you.